You're absolutely right that, and I've always said this to my students, that I can understand the concept of the shadow intellectually. It's not a really difficult concept to think about, but in order to embody it, in order to know what it means to recognize your shadow, to catch yourself in that moment when that emotional trigger just touches you and you know you're about to give in and absolutely explode. Can you in that moment almost step outside yourself, stop yourself, and really kind of break down the consequences? Is this the right moment for the release of that shadow projection? Can I do this a different way? What are the consequences? What environment am I in? And is this the most opportune moment to allow for that particular release? Sometimes yes, sometimes no.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. It is not breaking news. It is not hidden wisdom that one of my biggest philosophical influences is the late mythopoetic sage psychiatrist Dr. Carl Jung. Seasoned Wonder Dippers will know that I've dabbled, I have babbled for dozens, probably hundreds of hours on recording about Jungian topics. But that said, I'm not sure I've had an actual scholar of Jung in the mind meld before. Many therapists and psychologists, but I don't think a real scholar. And I am so glad that Dr. Kevin Liu is filling that void, my friends, because not only is he incredibly knowledgeable and insightful on that topic, we have a strange amount in common. We're both obsessed with how Jung and esoteric topics find their way into the media. Actually, he tells me that he sort of secretly implants Jungian topics and Easter eggs in video games, which obviously really perked my Wonder Whiskers up. I found out we both grew up playing in bands. So this was one of those mind melds where we just drop into the space and then teleport and it's over. The conversation just transcended space and time, at least from my perspective. Kevin is also the co-author of the new book, C.G. Jung's Collected Works, The Basics, which will be out in just a few weeks. He's also got a new academic paper out on synchronicity and archetype that revolves around the film Akira and Greta Thunberg's selection as Time Person of the Year. And those may seem like two incredibly far-flung topics, but it's actually an example of how archetype can constellate in meat space and synchronicity and so many other fascinating things. And speaking of fascinating fare, I really think we bring all the wonder nuggets you could possibly want in this mind meld. We get into the shadow, we get into synchronicity, we get into, as I alluded to above, how the esoteric and Jungian topics seem to continue to find their way into media, video games, anime, but also how archetypes express themselves in popular culture. I'm just going to mention it right now. Kevin and I are both obsessed with this band called Sleep Token. We get into that in this mind meld. I just wanted to mention it in case there are any fellow worshippers amongst you. So anyway, if all of that doesn't perk up your Wonder Whiskers, I believe you may be interfacing with the wrong media vessel, my friend. Links for Dr. Kevin Liu are in the description. Same for Third Eye Drops. On that note, support us, my friends. We need it. Tickle that algorithm with a like, a sub, a share, a comment, whatever. It is all immensely helpful, especially when we're competing against these AI-driven channels that are putting out like 5 videos a day. And do subscribe to Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to podcasts, because we have a back catalog of over 300 mind melds just like this one that will never be on YouTube. So do subscribe to Third Eye Drops on Apple Pod, Spotify, whatever your pod platform of choice is. And if you want to go deeper with me and over 200 other initiates, join us over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. Not only is it the most direct way to support Third Eye Drops, you get a patron-only Discord server, or access to one that is. You get a bunch of stickers, pins, shirts, and rewards depending on your pledge level. And you can also join in on our monthly Wonder Gym hangs, our monthly Zoom hangs, our book club, and more, all at patreon.com third eye drops. And with that, my friends, let's meld minds with the wise Dr. Kevin Liu. It is wonderful to be in the mind meld with you, my friend. As we were just saying, we've been going back and forth for quite some time. You're in kind of an interesting liminal point in your journey with all of this stuff. So I'm sure some of these themes are going to be very fresh and relevant to you. But the reason I wanted to have you on is I really have been loving your lectures that I've been stumbling across on YouTube. And I was like, man, I would love to sit down and get some time with this man. So I'm excited to finally do it.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for your patience. And yeah, truly blessed to be in the room with you. So I'm looking forward to it.
Me too, man. Me too. So I guess, people who watch this channel are likely familiar with Jung, likely familiar with a lot of the sort of core principles, at least the popular ones, of his analytical theory and philosophical outlook. But if you can take yourself back, what was it for you that initially pulled you in to Jung and his sort of, mythopoetic way of approaching the psyche, personal growth, spirituality?
For most people who read Jung, it's that feeling of a personal connection. Uh, there are aspects of Jung's writing that are very difficult, but there are moments where it's kind of absolute clarity and beauty, and it's how we kind of connect with the text and see ourselves in the text as well. So at the time, I was an undergraduate at the University of Toronto, and initially I didn't even want to go to university. I kind of did it as this thing, my parents are kind of hounding me. I'm just going to go do it,
Mm-hmm.
um, get the degree, focus on my music and my band. And if it doesn't work out, I'll train as a chef. And that was the kind of thought process at that time. But once I was at the University of Toronto, I was really blessed to be in history classes with Professor Timothy Brooke,
Mm-hmm.
who's bounced around quite a bit, but he's now retired from the University of British Columbia. And there was that moment where I felt truly recognized, not only in what he was teaching, but how he was teaching.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I was fortunate enough to become his research assistant. So I was the youngest research assistant in the history department at the University of Toronto.
Cool.
And I was helping him, I was learning from him. And one day he just kind of said to me, as if it was a matter of fact, and he just said it in passing, that it would be a real shame and a loss to academia if you didn't pursue this route and
Wow.
this career. And it was that kind of moment of recognition where I think we all need that, where people
Yeah.
just mirror you and say, I see you. And from there, I was totally committed to that path of academia. And he was kind of giving me the basics and training me of this is what it actually means to be in the mix. But it was at a point where I was doing some research for him, and I was just looking at books, texts, and it just kind of dawned on me that this isn't necessarily, or just this aspect of the work isn't going to fulfill me.
Mm.
And he was completely open to that, and he kind of set me on my way. It's like University of Toronto, it's a big multi-faculty institution. Go find yourself, go
Yeah.
find what you want to do. And I was searching around, and there were these suite of Jungian courses at New College that I was always interested in, but I never kind of took the deep dive and jumped into it. So I decided to do that. And I think by the second lecture, so these courses were designed and taught by Professor Anne Yeoman,
Mm-hmm.
who's a Jungian analyst who trained in Zurich at the C.G. Jung Institute. She was also the dean of New College at the time.
Wow.
And it was right then and there that I was completely floored, not only by the work that we were reading, but by her teaching style and her compassion. And I think Jung always said, it doesn't matter what you study. It's the person kind of teaching it to you that really counts, and how that message is being conveyed. And
Yeah.
that's the transformative aspect. So I attached to Anne, but also I remember reading the collection she assigned, which was Joseph Campbell's collection of,
Mm.
I think is the Portable Jung. That's what it's called. Actually,
Oh, yeah,
probably still
yeah.
have, and it's actually out of print in the UK for a long time. And I think I was reading that, and it was just this kind of eureka moment where I felt Jung was writing about me. It's like, wow, this is a guy who's writing something that's kind of, cutting straight to
Yeah.
the chase. Any kind of psychological difficulties I was going through, things that I was thinking about and trying to process and understand in my life, there is someone who's writing right here, and it speaks to me. And I think that is the beauty of Jung, that he's trying to find this balance between the tension of saying something general about the human condition, but also trying to say something very specific about the
Right.
individual as well. So is that kind of tension between the general and the individual that I think it really caught me. And I think from that moment, I was resolved, like, this is the career path. I kind of stormed into Anne's office and say, this is what I want to do, and you're going to help me. And she probably
Yeah.
thought, oh, you cheeky little shit, you know? But it turned into a lifelong mentorship and friendship. And, her and I are now just on the verge of kind of bringing out a book together, and also a big paper as well, which we're kind of looking forward to. We've worked on it for a long time.
That's exciting, man. That's really exciting. And it's sadly rare, I think, for people to really find a path like that, particularly in academia. But what is funny about that is I have an acquaintance who I used to play, he wasn't in a band with me, but we used to play in bands in the sort of same music scene.
Mhm.
And what's funny is he is finishing up a PhD in philosophy right now, and he's also a chef on the side, like always posting stuff about food. I'm like, man, that's what's with this weird mythopoetic milieu of like all these different routes of exploration and creation. There's some overlap there for sure of trying to find some authentic way to both express yourself,
Yeah.
do some kind of verb, but also have this psychological catharsis where there is no direct path often
Yeah.
for that psychological catharsis that we're all seeking to occur.
Mhm.
So we just
Mhm.
try to channel it into some creative thing. We try to channel it into a vocation, an art, or whatever it is. um,
Sure.
but that aside, um, that's really exciting that you're on the cusp of publishing this book and publishing this paper. But
Yeah.
I do wonder, as a scholar of all of this stuff, that you're more adept in these concepts than probably 99 point whatever percent of all people on the planet. But one of the things that strikes me when I'm reading Jung is kind of the same thing I was just describing, where it's difficult. So it's like conceptually, you understand the value, philosophically, you understand the value, but then how you experience this like direct catharsis,
Mhm.
that's a different technique. There's like,
Yeah.
there's some kind of, it's almost like it's funny because like in a way, typically when you talk about a synchronicity, for instance, it's
Mhm.
this event, that this psychophysical event that somehow bridges the two quote unquote realities in a way that doesn't make sense to us. But it's
Yeah.
almost like you have to do a reverse synchronicity to go beyond the intellectual understanding of some of these ideas that Jung presents, because you can interface with ideas like archetypes, for instance, and be like, ooh, yeah, yeah, he's really onto something here. But then to feel it in your own life, to feel it like, oh, yes, I feel this in myself, that's like a different technique. And I wonder how, as a scholar, you experience that kind of thing, or if it's difficult even for you as someone who's so brined in these concepts.
My first gut reaction, I'm really pleased and honored, of all these accolades. But I think a big part of academia, if you are really serious about, is also not knowing and
Yeah.
admitting when you don't know things and when things are difficult. So, I try to kind of keep myself grounded in that way. But thank you all the same. I mean, there's so much there to unpack and to think about. So I'll try to kind of, go back and speak to some of those aspects. I mean, this thing about sublimation, what Freud would call sublimation, and
Yeah.
kind of redirecting the libido into artistic endeavors, etc. I mean,
Mhm.
there's something very powerful there in terms of culture, but particularly in terms of food and the connotations that we actually have with food. And I think the main point I'm trying to get at here is that if we understand our subjectivity, we get to a closer understanding of why we're compelled to write or to create,
Mhm.
but then that also helps us fuel an approach that doesn't necessarily avoid subjectivity and what is driving us to do something, but embraces it and makes it part of the methodology and the thinking process itself. So I think
Mm-hmm.
that's where a lot of my thinking is occupied right now. And Jung is fantastic for that because it presents a model, a way of understanding the human mind and the psyche that allows us to frame why we're attracted to certain things, why we want to spend 10 years of our lives thinking about one specific thing, if you will. But food is so powerful, so psychoanalytic. And for me, thinking about the creative side, which I think you've hit the nail on the head, we express our creativity in different ways. But there's something there about not only, consumption, food as life, but also the connotation of family, that in many cultures and in many families, food is where we gather to celebrate, to think, to laugh, to have those arguments at the dinner table.
Yeah.
It is such a psychically charged moment and act. So
Yeah.
I'm not surprised when, I hear that scholars like to dabble with food and cooking
Mm.
and thinking about food on the side. So that's absolutely, perfect. In terms of theory and practice, you're right. You're absolutely right that, and I've always said this to my students, that I can understand the concept of the shadow intellectually. It's not a really
Right.
difficult concept to think about,
Mm-hmm.
but in order to embody it, in order to know what it means, to recognize your shadow, to catch yourself in that moment when that emotional trigger just touches you and you're about to give in and absolutely explode. Can you in that moment almost step outside yourself, stop yourself, and really kind of break down the consequences? Is
Yeah.
this the right moment for the release of that shadow projection? Can I do this a different way? What are the consequences, in terms of my own decorum? What environment am I in? And is this the most opportune moment to allow for that particular release? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And I think a lot of thinkers and clinicians would argue that it's difficult to just approach things from a theoretical point of view, and that in order to fully appreciate what Jung and the other talking therapists and depth psychologists and psychoanalysts were trying to do, is that you have to go through therapy yourself. Now,
Mm.
I'm in two minds about that. I mean, having taught at the University of Essex and running the MA Jungian and Post Jungian Studies for basically 14 years. I did it since I was 28, so I was running with it for a long time.
Wow.
I actually took myself into Jungian analysis because in terms of coming from a genuine place, how can I teach these concepts if I haven't experienced what it
Yeah.
means to be in that therapeutic space, and what that means in terms of not only thinking about the concepts, applying the concepts, but also living the concepts in your own life. Um, I mean, the analysis was absolutely fine, but equally, what I found, because of my own positioning as an academic and scholar in this field, that created a very interesting dynamic that I constantly
Yeah.
reflect on.
Really
So
interesting.
that's perhaps like a story for another time. I'm also big on thinking about of how we kind of democratize Jungian psychology and analytical psychology, because if you think about it, what does it cost to actually go into therapy?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
are there ways that we can still benefit from Jung's ideas, but in different contexts and in different modalities?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Many would argue that just based on that fact that therapy itself is a very kind of elitist endeavor.
Yeah.
Individuation comes across as a
Yeah.
very kind of elitist endeavor. It is for the few,
Can
i.e.,
I
those.
interject here because
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Sure.
I really like that you have an individuation lecture with quite a few views on YouTube, and you make this really funny point at the end that you're alluding to, which is like, you go through this whole really beautiful mythopoetic way of looking at self-development, what Jung called individuation. You talk about your own life, you talk about what it is and everything. And then at the very end, you're like, in a lighthearted but serious way, you're like, so how much is individuation going to cost you, right? Because
Yeah.
it's like it's to your point, if you want to do it the way that it's prescribed by Jung, by depth psychologists, you got to go into analysis, and that is not a trivial thing to do financially.
But I think what you're doing here, and some of my students have done, is to think about the social mission of
Yeah.
psychoanalysis as well. So I've had my former colleagues at Essex, still colleagues, are thinking about free clinics. So what is at the heart of the social mission, in trying to provide that therapy, that holding space for those, financially who aren't able to do that. And I think that's at the heart of some of those early thinkers and therapists. But equally, we need to think of ways where we can still approach these ideas with integrity. Be careful to say that we're doing therapeutic work, because we're not necessarily, but there is such a thing as thinking therapeutically and being able to hold a space,
Yeah.
where these therapeutic ideas can help us kind of contain that thinking, and to make sure that we're not going off into these wild interpretations, wild psychoanalysis. I mean, a great example, one of my former PhDs, now colleague, Dr. Bryony Clark, she created a game. She gamified active imagination.
Cool.
And the whole
Cool.
part of that was to democratize it. Because even at that level, what Jung was saying about active imagination was that, I only reserve it for my patients who are pretty much near the end of
Mm.
analysis, and who are able to kind of um, able to hold that very delicate balance and line between conscious and
Yeah.
unconscious. With active imagination, it's dreaming with open eyes. You're basically
Right.
delving into the phenomenology of the dreamscape and the imagination and the fantasies that are coming to the forefront. And you can understand why Jung would be a bit careful with who he's
Yeah.
prescribing this activity to. But again, if you look at the thinking and writing around it, it is couched as a very elitist endeavor. So I think what Bryony was trying to do with her game is that there are different ways to think about this and to express this without the need necessarily of that mediation of the
Yeah.
therapist.
Yeah.
And I think any endeavor that tries to be careful, informed about how we bring those ideas into the public realm, yeah, it's absolutely valuable.
Definitely. Yeah. And now I almost can't believe I haven't made this direct connection myself. And you're already giving me epiphanies here, Kevin. Is as a kid, I was super, super drawn into RPGs, like these
Mm,
archetypal hero's journey type stories that were, dealing with all of this arcane imagery. I was just talking to another YouTuber who uh, has been very successful talking about a lot of this stuff, which is like the sort of esoteric and occult and Jungian
mhm,
themes that play out throughout a lot of games, anime, movies, um, and dissecting that and identifying it. And in some cases, probably hitting on things that were even unconscious on the part of the person who made the game or chose the symbol or whatever. But
yeah,
that totally, in a kind of inductive way, you connecting active imagination with a game. It's like, well, of course, that's why I was attracted to games, because they were providing me this sort of catharsis that I was looking for and not finding in my boring ass, regular, like middle class, going to elementary school and sitting down and, going through the motions and the mundane beige reality of American Midwestern life. And it's like, yeah, of course I want to go into these deeper worlds of symbol
sure.
and heroic, dragon slaying. But
Yeah.
I don't think that ever changes. It's just that we require different
Mhm.
means to express those desires. And obviously active imagination is really aimed at doing that. I read Inner Work recently by Robert Johnson, and that there's a lot of attention paid to exactly what you're saying, that this relationship between I'm not gonna babble about it too much because I want to let you talk about it. But um
Yeah.
just to say that it makes sense that you would begin to approach these deeper ways of directly interfacing with the unconscious and archetypes and all of
Sure.
these sort of far-flung ideas that we innately want to connect with but don't know how, through something
Yeah.
like a game. So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Can you buy this game?
Bryony is in the process of trying to start up her own company. but I can
Cool.
definitely provide you with the details. You can have a conversation with her. She's fantastic. Let me just say, Michael, I'm part of an initiative right now on Jungian gaming, and
Mm,
people within academia kind of sometimes they turn up their nose to it and say, oh, this is very popular culture. But I think, as you've seen from my body of work, I write the kind of more academic stuff, but I love the popular culture stuff because I feel that psychology is there as well. So Jung had this idea of psychological art versus visionary art, and visionary being the kind of more high forms of art that for him he felt tapped into the unconscious, whereas psychological art could be art that consciously utilizes
mm,
psychological concepts, but it already does the mediating and explanation for you. So that for him, it isn't as true, if you will, to the mystery of the unconscious and really engaging to that level of depth. And I think my argument would be, but that's still the psychology there. With archetypal imperatives, they manifest based on what the contemporary zeitgeist is pressurizing the psyche to kind of express in what particular mode. And
yeah.
gaming is absolutely there. I mean, I think I read a stat a while ago that back in 2019 or 2020, the gaming industry was worth, I think, at least four times more than the movie industry. And that's
Oh,
really
yeah.
telling in terms of where the storytelling is moving, where the expression of myth is actually moving, and where people are expressing themselves. So I can just say, without giving away too much, is that there is already material where clinicians are reflecting on how dreams are being presented as games. So it's finding its
Mm,
way into the consulting room that, with gaming in terms of kind of its explosion in popularity, but also the intricacy, the complexity of some of the
mm,
narratives, they're really providing a holding space for people to find expression, but also becomes uh, a place, if you will, where our unconscious is beginning to reside and to find expression, like it or lump it. So for me, analytical psychology has many ways that it can engage, if you will, with this phenomenon of gaming. So there's something about understanding games themselves. There is the purposeful use of Jung in the creation of material. So I can't name this other individual that we're working with, but he is part. He's worked with big companies, put it that way. The
cool.
really big companies that put games on the shelves. He's been part of some really big games. He purposely puts Easter eggs into his games that are
Ooh,
psychoanalytically informed. So there
man.
is that aspect that it's already informing how these creatives in the larger industries are working with these concepts, and Bryony being more of the kind of independent side of things. So you have then analytical psychological concepts, psychoanalytic concepts permeating not only the big market games, but also the independent games as well. Um, and there's something here, I think, also about digital dramaturgies and how
Mm,
we write narratives. Something that is potentially meaningful and can kind of again contain that journey that people may be experiencing or living through the games. Zelda
yeah.
being
Yeah, yeah.
a, an amazing one.
Yes.
It's all there that you walk into. You start off in a very normal realm, and oh my goodness, there's this big moment, and boom, you're you're into another
Right.
world. It is the
He doesn't,
hero's
yeah, he
journey.
doesn't talk a
Yeah,
lot. He doesn't have a lot of, yeah, there's like, he doesn't have this personal history, which, and I have a love-hate relationship because sometimes I want to get like pulled into a story where you're this really fleshed out character. But in his case, it really is like an interesting portal for active imagination because he is almost like this blank slate of just like a hero. He doesn't have this past. Like oftentimes
yeah,
he's sort of dropping, like I played not the newest one, but the first one on Switch that came out, and you're just kind of dropped into the world, like you reawaken, almost like you're
mhm,
just reincarnated into this body, and you're fighting this archetypal battle against this force of darkness. Yeah, I can totally
yeah.
see that.
And there are even, I mean, games that are so explicit in their use of Jung. So Persona, I mean,
Mm,
it's just
yeah,
absolutely there.
I love
You know,
Persona, dude. I love it. Yeah.
I've never played it, but I'm big on the persona and rethinking the persona, because it gets such a bad rap in analytical psychology, and it's like, why? There's something really important there which we can kind of approach and think about. But also, students tell me about Genshin Impact. Baldur, I think, was another one that was some, I can't remember, the third edition just came out, or the
Yeah,
third series.
yeah, I haven't played
Yeah,
it, but I did see that. Yeah.
so I think it's rife in terms of whether it consciously utilizes or mobilizes psychoanalytic ideas to evoke something in us. And I
Mhm.
mean, that's
Mhm.
been done before in terms of the use of psychoanalysis and marketing. But equally, the unconscious ways it does it as well, where it doesn't necessarily have to consciously engage with those ideas, or try to express them, but equally those ideas are such a part of the mainstream
Yeah.
and our way of framing and understanding the mind, that it's inevitable that it's going to find expression.
Mhm. So I know you just said you haven't played Persona, but have you had any students sort of like walk you through the gist of what's going on in the game and the sort of larger archetype that plays out in the game?
Please, no, not really, but
Okay,
you can tell me more about it, and we,
man.
we can do an ad hoc thinking about it together.
Yeah. Yeah. So it exists in this larger world called Shin Megami Tensei. And Shin Megami, well, this sort of is a spoiler. I don't want to tell you what that translates to just yet. So you again, you start out, you're sort of this character who is thrust into this situation where they essentially gain an ability to consciously enter the unconscious realm. And without getting too deep into everything that's going on within this realm, you have all of these archetypal um beings. So you have like the Goetia, like the 72 demons of the Goetia. You have all the gods and goddesses from various pantheons. You have fairies. You have all these different things, and you will encounter them as enemies. But then eventually, you can befriend them, and you can use them as a persona that you then wield, like as like sort of a weapon or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then the bosses essentially are people who exist in the exoteric outer realm, but they have like secrets, like there's a gym teacher who's like secretly a perv and is like doing like all sorts of uncouth things with female students and manipulating people, and you
Mm-hmm.
go into his unconscious and basically fight the shadow version of him, defeat the
Mm-hmm.
shadow version of him, and then all of that stuff floods into reality and comes to a head where they have like this big breakdown and admit to everything that they did. But then it goes even deeper where you realize that all of this stuff that's playing out in a very Jungian way is
Mm-hmm.
actually wrapped in this Gnostic fable where the very last boss usually in these games is like Yaldabaoth, or however you
Mm-hmm.
pronounce his name, like the sort of dark false god demiurge, basically. So
Mm-hmm.
everybody's sort of trapped in this false Gnostic reality, and
Mm-hmm.
you're doing things throughout the game that seem heretical and sacrilegious, but it's because you know that you're being trapped by this in this sort of false reality by this false god. And
Yeah, yeah.
this is sort of like the big trope of a lot of Japanese RPGs, is like you have to like kill what appears to be god at the end to find the
Mm-hmm.
truth. So
Yeah.
it's very, very deep, but Shin Megami Tensei translates to something like reincarnation of the true goddess or something like that. And it's sort of
Mm-hmm.
this Gnostic idea
Yeah.
of you're destroying the idea of God so that you
Mm-hmm.
can actually come into contact with true divinity. And of course,
Yeah,
this idea exists through Jung, through Campbell. Like there's this great Campbell lecture on the chakras where he talks about the Ajna chakra, the third eye chakra, and he talks about the symbol of this chakra being this multi-armed goddess who's actually holding the head of God in one of her hands, the severed head of God. And it's the
yeah.
same idea of, to actually experience God, to actually have the non-dual ineffable experience, you have to destroy the mask of God. You have to destroy the idea of God to actually interact with
Sure.
God. So it's pretty deep. It's pretty deep.
Yeah, and a lot of that already aligns, I think, with Jung's thinking about the numinous, God, the God above God, which is, Paul Tillich. So there's a lot of connections there. I mean, from what you're describing, there is that sense of the release of the spark, that kind of killing it, of that which binds you in order to kind of achieve and appreciate that kind of higher reality. I mean, this integration of battling archetypal beings and then integrating them, it sounds like this metaphor, if you will, of integrating aspects of the unconscious, things that we don't know about ourselves, that we probably would want to hide about ourselves, and then letting that emerge, if you will, or inform or expand the personality. And this breakdown of this gym teacher sounds like that cathartic moment, if you will,
Yeah.
where the floodgates are open, and there's that beginnings, if you will, of thinking of all those shadow aspects, but also the kind of catharsis we might experience within therapy itself,
Yeah.
or these kind of transformational moments. So it seems very complex, actually. But again, going back to this idea of the persona and people thinking of it as this mask that we wear, it's a hindrance, if you will, to the realization of the self. When we move towards an appreciation of ourself, the big S self, the potential that is inborn in us, that we have to heed the call, to come as close to that ideal as possible. It's always kind of couched as, but we got to get through the persona first. It's this barrier. And Hopke was the one, I think, who first really broke the mold and said, well, hold on a second. I He really didn't think that the persona was about that, and I completely agree. Because if you think of the persona as the way we relate to the world in
Hmm.
terms of decorum, so there are certain roles that we play in our life, be it for me personally, a son, a brother, a husband, a father, a lecturer, a manager, all these types of things. There's a kind of certain decorum that goes with it, and gives me a certain code that allows me to survive. So
Yeah.
when I'm speaking to my students, I can't speak to them in the same way that I'm speaking to you right now, or I'm speaking to my closest friends that I've grown up with. There's something about the social codes and mores that we need to adhere to.
Yep.
And also, if I had my professor persona on, and I'm interacting with my wife, and I'm constantly in this didactic mode of speaking on high, you know what? It's not going to look pretty, man. It's
Right. Right.
so there's something about, for Jung, not allowing the mask to fuse to your face, where you actually
Yes.
over identify with the persona and become your persona. Now, having said that, I also see the persona as the archetype of relationality that connects us to the world, that makes us
Mm.
understand that, in order for us to thrive, not just as individuals, but as a collective, our individuation depends on how we relate to the larger world and how we're contained by the larger world. So Jung always describes individuation as, yes, a movement away from the collective, but ultimately a return to the collective as well. And what the individual stands for admits that larger collectivity. And I think that's so crucial. The persona
Totally.
helps us do that, right? Because if we were always showing our true selves 24/7, I don't think we would be great people, actually. And I don't
No.
think people would hang out with us. So there's something about that. And also about the persona, the masks that we wear, the work that we take on. And I think this is Hopke's point, a really important point, is that so long as the persona that we craft and we create comes closer and closer to the image of the archetypal self, it doesn't become a hindrance, but it becomes a bridge to the
Yeah. Yeah.
self,
Yeah.
right? So if
Hmm.
if I'm thinking about individuation at work, and the roles we adopt, because we've talked about this previously as well, um, being a professor, it's not what it's all cracked up to be. There is a lot of work involved. There is a lot of us thinking about a harsh external climate that makes us react as an institution, as an academic faculty, in very particular ways. So I can definitely say that my ideal or fantasy of what academia looked like when I was with Tim, seeing it from the perspective of a student, now being on the other side, you kind of get hit with the reality principle. It's really difficult, but it's how we kind of stay in that space of realizing I can still find my voice and my creativity here, but I need to find an authentic way that helps me manage the challenges that I face in my everyday role, but still allows me to move closer and closer to that ideal that I had, that kind of naivete, which is still really important actually, of what it means to be an academic. And I think that can apply to everyone, that whatever our roles are, whatever we choose to be, so long as we try to craft a more authentic persona that acts as a bridge to realizing ourselves, to realizing our potential, I don't see any issues there whatsoever. So the persona is not a hindrance, it's a catalyst.
Very interesting and really, really well said. And just a quick 101 for people in case they don't understand exactly what we're talking about. The the part of your psyche that you're aware of is your ego. The mask on your ego is your persona, this way that you interact with the world, the way that you choose to sculpt yourself, the way that you present yourself. You're kind of alluding to all of these things. And I think everybody watching is pretty aware of it, but just in case, I wanted to outline that. But I think what you're saying is so important because there are all of these more far flung, even mystical ideas in
Mm-hmm.
Jung's thought. And the starting point, like we kind of want to get away from the starting point, right? The persona, the ego. We know what that stuff is. Let's get to the more mystical, dreamy,
Yeah,
mythopoetic stuff. But when you do that, you're essentially just spiritually bypassing, right? Like you're psychologically or mythologically bypassing because you're trying to leave behind these parts of the world that you need to interact with. And it's,
mm-hmm.
yeah, I think you're totally highlighting something really important. I'm trying to think of like a good metaphor for it.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like the armor you start the game with versus
Mm-hmm.
like some sacred mithril armor that you're wearing at the end of the game. It's like you still need the armor, but
Yeah,
you don't, and it's not you want to get rid of the armor. You want it to be constructed of this sublimated sacred material from
sure.
doing the inner work rather
Yeah.
than having it being this like flesh eating bacteria that you're forced to wear on your face. I think that's
Yeah.
where the bad rap of the persona comes from, is it's like this thing that we're coerced into wearing, that's like the smile we wear on the outside while the soul is eroding on the inside. And I think a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people do feel that way. So for a lot of people it's important, but that idea of getting rid of it is not, that's
No.
that's warned against by every Jungian analyst, right? You can't get rid of these parts of yourself you don't like. You can't get rid of these shadow elements. It's
Mm-hmm.
told in where does that myth originate? Do you know, the one of like the cursed object that you can't get rid of, that you keep trying to get rid of, but it keeps coming back and keeps coming back. It's like that almost.
I mean, I'm thinking about the return of the repressed, in
Mm,
that sense, that, however much we want to push something away, it always kind of comes back. But I mean, I've got some reflections on what you were saying there. Um, I completely agree. I once had a conversation with a good friend and colleague, Professor Andrew Samuels, who was one of the first professors of analytical psychology in the world.
cool.
Great colleague, great friend, really wise man, a mentor to me in many ways as well. And I remember just reflecting on with him on analysis and what it meant. And obviously, I was kind of speaking from my own subjectivity and experience. I was saying, you know what? I mean, is it always transformative? Because I was talking about money concerns, family life, moving house. And I think I flippantly said something along the lines, it wasn't very deep in terms of my own fantasy of what a deep, deep, deep analysis actually is. And he just came back with one line and goes, and why do you say that? Just because you're at that level or speaking about those things doesn't mean that it's not deep.
Mm,
And it kind of made me reflect. more and more, it's like, actually, what kind of ideas and fantasies am I going into, or sorry, are in play that are altering my perception of what the transformational aspect of analysis might actually be like. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm coming with certain preconceived ideas, and if they don't live up to it, maybe I'm missing the numinous that is in the everyday,
Mm-hmm.
in the everyday kind of mundane. And I think that's really important to preserve, that um, individuation isn't always this big, massive, beautiful journey. It's just living your life with integrity, cleaning up your garden, tending to your garden, sweeping the floor of worship, if you will.
Yeah.
The other
Yeah.
thing that really caught my mind was this idea of the persona in popular culture. And I remember writing an undergraduate essay on Slipknot. I think my
Oh,
my teacher
nice.
was quite shocked at the kind of ritual aspects. And this idea of the mask, I think, especially in current popular culture, is something that's actually really fascinating, not just in
Yes.
terms of Slipknot, Mushroom Head, but Vessel. Thinking
Yes.
of the
Thank
current
you.
phenomenon, completely just blowing things up. And the it wasn't an overnight sensation. There were 3 albums, right? There was
Yeah,
the
so
slow
sleep. You're talking
building
about
of
Sleep Token. You mentioned Vessel, but I just want
absolutely.
to. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So this band
It's
Sleep.
kinda
Yeah, let's just give people a little introduction on Sleep Token. And do you want me to do it or do you want to do it?
you go for it.
Okay, so there's this band called Sleep Token, and they sort of fit into the lineage of those bands you mentioned, like Slipknot, but they're not. They're way more mercurial in the type of music they produce. They're not. You really can't be like they're a metal band. They're a pop. They're definitely not a pop band, but like they bring a lot of sonic elements together, and
Mhm.
so that's really interesting. Like from a sort of mercurial standpoint, right there. But
Yeah.
then the lore behind the band is incredibly archetypally rich because they all wear masks. The lead singer who writes everything calls himself Vessel. He says that he is basically doing the work of a god that he calls Sleep. He says this god Sleep comes to him, and all of his lyrics seem to be about being in a relationship with this being that sometimes is like wanting to eat him, that sometimes it seems like it's like a romantic relationship. And there's kind of an argument amongst the fan base online, I've noticed, where some people think like, now the lore is just a bunch of aesthetic bullshit and it's like really just love songs about some girl he broke up with. And there's other people who are like, no, the lore is everything. And of course I'm way more one of the lore is everything people. um but regardless, it's very, very interesting, and it's really begun to capture the imagination of the masses because they've exploded in popularity over the last year or so.
Mhm.
And I'm really enjoying watching their rise to prominence for because I'm aware of all this like stuff going on behind the scenes, and I have so many questions about what's really going on in that
Yeah.
man's mind. So it's
Yeah.
super interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so amazing. Like I'm just getting goosebumps thinking about all these things, where we could take this right
Oh
now.
yeah.
I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's the music that speaks to people, but it gets amplified through the lore and the mythology that's built around it, and really builds that extra layer of connection. So in terms of the style, you're right. It is almost kind of genre bending and genre
Yeah.
defining, in the sense that there are elements of gent in there. There, as you say, there are those kind of really pop sensibilities. Some great lyrics, but also balladry. I
Yeah.
found in this third album, and being able to kind of play on those sonic spheres and levels and transition almost seamlessly. It's just a beautiful thing, especially if you're a musician, and even
Yep.
if you're not a musician. To have someone able to kind of speak to that emotional core of yourself. I think that's what music is all about, the alchemy of putting
Yeah.
sounds and words together. There's something about that combination that is, yeah, it's magical. There's
Yeah.
no other way to kind of describe it. Now I've thought about this a little bit, so I'm going to throw out
Great.
some ideas
Great.
and think about it.
Please. I'm excited.
Sleep is the archetype, vessel is the archetypal image, and the followers, i.e., the audience, the fans, are the complexes that are
Ooh.
not only ultimately tied to the archetypal imperative. So the complex is ultimately um, the source of the archetype is, oh, sorry, the source of the complex is ultimately an archetype. So
Mm-hmm.
there's something about the followers, the audience, that's tied to sleep, but also a kind of more fleshy manifestation of that imperative. And I think that's where the music allows for people to interpret based on their own lived experience. And every time you have that interpretation, it gives it even more life because it constellates, it becomes real again in life. So Vessel brings the music, is the conduit of you, if you will, into the world. But then we play our own part in terms of how we generate that mythology, live that mythology in a very fleshy existence. And guess what? Make no mistake that a kid going to a Sleep Token concert will one day be the next big thing as well. So there's something there about the
Yeah.
lineage, the legacy, the power of the music itself. I also think that a lot of the ideas circulating around sleep, it really struck me as another manifestation or archetypal image of another popular culture figure, the Sandman.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
you know, one of my absolute favorite authors, Neil Gaiman, but the
Mm-hmm.
graphic novel series, now Netflix series. I mean, it just strikes me as that bringer of both dreams and nightmares together, you know,
Yeah.
and kind of governing, if you will, this realm. Those are my initial ideas. What do you think, Michael?
Yeah, you bring up something really interesting, the relationship between the archetypal image and complexes. I hadn't thought about it quite in that way, but that's very interesting. And I think the way that I had been looking at it is almost like this manifestation of the sort of, you could think of it as the individuation process or the alchemical process, because alchemy is one of those things that plays with that he plays with a lot of alchemical wording, in songs like Alkaline, but without getting too, but a lot more like throughout the catalog. But without getting too nerdy on the specifics for people that haven't heard it, what's interesting to me is it's like this. On one hand, it's this manicured, presented manifestation of the process of spiritual longing, spiritual contact,
Mm,
the what ends up really like, so what is, like, let's say everybody here, let's do a thought experiment. You're experiencing spiritual longing. Things are happening to your life, to you in your life on the outside. And then something finally catalyzes that moment of actually touching the numinous, the what seems to be the intelligence outside of you, and you can't go back from that moment. Like, once that moment occurs, that moment is now more important to you than anything else going on in your life. And it's sort of like that impulse we were talking about at the beginning of the pod, that like wanting to find a way to verb the ineffable. Like, you can't really do it directly in a lot of cases, so you have to do it through your art, through your creativity. And what that really looks like is being fucking eaten, man. And he
mhm,
talks about that a lot, the sensation of being eaten by this thing, by
mhm,
this god, or by this whatever it is. And the way that I view that is that if you really give yourself over to this big magnum opus project, that they use that kind of term in alchemy, or the great work in the occult or whatever,
mhm,
you're essentially offering your entire life up as a sacrifice to that process. Like,
mhm,
that's
mhm,
something that's going to consume you for your entire life. So it's sort of like this Pandora's box thing, where once you're in there, there's no going back. And maybe that's what the like take me back to Eden element of this is too, because like, so again, getting nerdy for people that don't know, but this most recent album they put out is called Take Me Back to Eden. And obviously Eden is sort of like this template of
mhm,
perfection and naivety and ignorance and being taken care of and existing in this idyllic state, and you can't go back there once you're in this process of like being in this transformation, for better or worse. So maybe it's reflections on that, but I don't know, I think there's way more to it than that too. I think even that's overly simplistic. um
mhm.
And then it's the classic question of how aware of this is he? How much of it is he aware of versus how much is he compelled to do? Or maybe he's reading Jung, or maybe he's reading
Mhm.
esoteric stuff. Like we just can't know. So it's fun to think about, though.
Yeah, and I think ultimately it's what we take away from it. The conversations that are starting, the thinking around it, that's catalyzed, if you will, by this representation, this absolute bombshell of a movement that hits the scene.
Yeah.
It's a kind of once in a lifetime thing where you find a band's like, this is different. This one's a bit of a game changer that again reshapes how things are produced and how they're shaped. So Jung was always saying and adamant that consciousness does change the unconscious. There's this idea that the unconscious is this entity, that it's massive, it's unchanging, it's built from these, historical experiences of humanity. And all that is true. But there are moments where there are sparks of consciousness that begin to reshape things, reshape, if you will, the unconscious. And that conversation happens. Not to say that it's happened in this particular instance, but it's very interesting, I think, how it is purposely being mobilized. I think there is something purposeful in what they're doing, but also the momentum it gains, and then it becomes something else, and that's beyond the creator. Whatever they put in
Yeah.
the world, it becomes another beast. But it's also really interesting to kind of reflect on the function that the band and their music and their performances are serving. So this idea that they're framing their concerts as rituals and worship.
Yeah. Yeah.
There is that sense of when when all is lost in terms of spirituality, when the skins or the containers that allow for that transmission and expression of the numinous, when they no longer hold sway, that energy will still find a way to present itself and to manifest itself. And
Yeah.
I think what we're both saying, Michael, is that it's finding its expression in Sleep Token, and just look at how many people are gravitating towards that. I mean, there's something psychological there that we need to think
Hmm.
about. But this idea, if you think about what we do when we go into a concert, so there's a lot of therapeutic value. We can think of it in terms of therapy. So there's an exchange of energy. We are offering literally money, much like in analysis. We are going into a space where we are putting reality or our perceptions of reality at the door in the hopes that something transformative can happen in this contained space. This us entering into the space is time limited, right? We're not going to
Hmm.
be there
Hmm.
forever. We're there at most for 2 hours. But hey, if you want to come check out the opening band, maybe it's a bit longer. But there's something about the implicit agreement that we enter, that in exchange for this energy of value, of monetary value, we are staving off what we consider reality in the outer world in order to be altered by this reality in this
Hmm.
space, which is equally as important and perhaps more transformative, in the hopes that what happens here can be taken out back into the real world, integrated. And I think that's the important point, that we delve into this, we get transfixed, we get taken to different places, but we always have to have a foot in our actual everyday lives, that I am still Kevin, or I am still Michael. This is my job, this is what I do. So to be able to kind of have those barriers in there, I think is important, so that, yes, let the music and the thinking and the myth behind it transfix us, take us places, but always have that ritual where we come back into the real world. And I think
Yeah.
that enjoyment is only heightened if we're able to do that.
Yes, man. Yes. And one of the things too that's striking me is if you want to go even, I mean, this Jung was so brilliant that all of this stuff is like forwards and backwards compatible, I feel like. But if you look at what I really think he is doing with this band, the closest corollary that I can find is when you go back into the more ancient world and the more ancient way of going through ritualistic experiences and initiatory experiences. There's a big difference in the way that they viewed their relationship with gods in the way that we typically view our relationship with gods now. Like, from
Mhm.
my understanding, like if you were part of, let's say, a Dionysian ritual in ancient Greece, and you were one of the maenads that were drinking the, the Dionysian wine that's imbued with all these pharmacological elements, to do that ritual was to merge with Dionysus, was to participate in Dionysus, was to like let you fill Dionysus and Dionysus fills you. And
Sure.
this is what he's got to be alluding to with Vessel. This is what he's got to be alluding to with like participating in this archetypal or godly image directly in a way that is like not metaphorical. Like, it's literal. Like,
Yeah.
he is literally
Yeah.
participating in this thing. And I think that that is secretly what all of us long for. And I think that's what,
Yeah.
I've been, are you familiar with the term theurgy?
No. Can you say a bit more?
Yeah. So it's this Greek word that translates to typically like God working. And
Mhm.
it was
Mhm.
seen as like the highest kind of ritual that you could do. So there's like Neoplatonists, like Iamblichus, like he's kind of seen as this magus sage like philosopher. And a lot of these ideas that are very deeply interwoven with Jung's philosophy too, but which I'll tell you what I mean by that in a second. But the notion of how do you call down, or it kind of depends on your vantage point, because there are different answers on this, either go up to participating in a god or pull down the god to participate in you.
Mhm.
And that's essentially what theurgy is, though we've lost the means by which, what rituals were done to make this occur. um
Mhm.
but it obviously, there's so many parallels in Jung, because he would talk about the idea of archetype possession. He would talk about the idea of um archetypal manifestations in the zeitgeist and stuff like that.
Sure.
And I
Sure.
feel like when we lose our ability to do those sorts of rituals directly, even through I met a guy, you might find this really interesting, or maybe strange, but I connected with this guy, Dr. Bruce McLennan, or it's either McLennan or McClellan. I think it's McLennan, but he's a
Mhm.
retired professor of computer science at
Mhm.
the University of Tennessee. But on the side, he's been interested in like Jung and Platonism, and
Mhm.
he thinks that active imagination and theurgy is essentially the same thing. That if you become serious enough and almost like religious enough about your participation in active imagination, you can
Mhm.
directly have experiences that are indistinguishably similar to
Mhm.
directly interfacing with different archetypal
Sure.
consciousnesses or deities or whatever. So
Sure.
it all ties
It's really
together.
it's really interesting. I mean, when you were talking about Dionysus, the one thing that always just I came back to, yes, there's that ecstasy there, that participation, if you will, but equally the ecstasy can tear us apart,
Oh yeah.
and
Oh
it
yeah.
can rip us apart. And what you were talking about there in terms of participating, coming close to those archetypal energies, if we do that in a contained way, and be able, if you will, to kind of reap the benefits, to delve into the unconscious, to see the goal, to bring the goal back, but be able to come back up. And I think that's really of the crucial and utmost importance. So even if we're going back to the example of music, um, in order for us to kind of create something truly special, magical, transformational, what are the ABCs that we need to know first and foremost? Well, as musicians, you learn your scales, right? You learn to play to a metronome. You learn the basics of composition,
If you're good.
things like that. These are the things. These are the basics, if you will, the kind of what I call building the strong enough ego in the first instance that then
Yeah.
allows you to delve into the unconscious, to see the chaos there, but then to be able to translate it into something that can be enjoyed and understood by your audience and society. And I think for Jung, a lot of artists who were before their time because society wasn't at a point where they could appreciate what was actually being presented to them, because that level of consciousness and thinking hadn't been up to par, if you will, with the artist who is then able to kind of delve in and to bring something back. And I think for Jung, that's why artists are so crucial, not only to culture, but but to psychological health in general, because they have that ability to hold the mirror back up to ourselves and say, this is what's missing from our society. This is what is lurking in the unconscious. And like it or lump it, you're going to have a look. You're going to have a gander at that.
Yeah.
But again, it's whether or not it can be appreciated at that particular time. So I would always go back to say, yes, it's all these amazing things, but equally, we can't forget that really important step back into consciousness, that kind of
Yeah.
resetting ourselves, that there's something of value there, but we have to do it consciously, in a very grounded manner, so that we can grow from that thing and not be completely overwhelmed by it.
Yes. So important, man. So important. Like we've seen what happens when, you know, uh, another realm that I dabble in is the visionary psychedelic realm. And we've
Mm,
seen what happens when that goes wrong. We've seen what
yeah.
happens when like, I would love to downplay psychedelic psychosis, but it's a real thing. And I was
Mhm.
just talking to a good friend um who's seen it happen multiple times right in front of his face, like people that and he's in this community. So this is not like I'm not trying to raise any alarm bells because it is a relatively small percentage of people who experience this, but it is possible and we should take it very seriously. And it's even in like Inner Work by Robert Johnson, he warns like if you're going to do active imagination,
Yeah.
very valuable, very powerful, you should do it. Also have someone on call. Like have a
Mhm.
friend
Mhm.
who understands what you're doing, even better have an analyst who understands what you're doing. And if you
Mhm.
feel like you're having trouble getting your feet back on the ground, give them a call and like
Yeah.
understand that you may need to reinstantiate yourself in this world. And even who I was mentioning before, this Dr. Bruce McLennan guy, he said one of the things he likes to do right after he's done with active imagination is like cook something and eat it, because that
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
that ritual of cooking and eating is sort of a grounding way to like, okay, I'm in this world. um and I like the mythological parallels too, because it's always like there's the story about uh Persephone eating the pomegranate in the underworld, and then that's like what, you ate the food of the underworld, now you're stuck there. So there's
Yeah.
something mythopoetic about it I like too.
I mean, it's interesting that we're kind of coming full circle back to food, and
Yeah, right, yeah.
eating, ingesting, the psychology of cannibalism as well. I mean, it's all very fascinating. I mean, the one thing I would say, this is not my area of expertise in terms of psychedelic
Cannibalism.
assisted. Oh no, well that too, but psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. But my former student and now colleague Marissa Swank, she wrote an award-winning paper in one of the Jungian journals called
Cool.
Mercurius Ubiquitous.
Oh,
That's someone
wow.
you that's someone you need to bring onto your show,
Yeah,
Michael.
wow. I would love
I'll
to.
give you details after that. She's amazing.
Yes, please. Please, please, please. That sounds really interesting. Do you remember the sort of crux of the paper?
I mean, a lot of it was based on her previous knowledge of being a part of a really large study in the US,
Hmm.
but also thinking, and this is what I really appreciate about her paper, looking at the more kind of historical aspects of how Jungians at the time of Jung were actually dabbling in this. So she did some archival work at the Wellcome Library in London, looking at some of the notes of how some of these Jungians were thinking about psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, but also how it loses traction, it loses, if you will, that momentum because of the stigma that is around it. And even Jung had a particular stigma around it, that,
Yeah.
it's already dangerous enough to delve into the unconscious. If, we were talking about the strong enough ego delving into the unconscious, here you're just completely blowing it away, because then you lose the possibility of that strong enough ego. And for
Yeah.
him, it was just too dangerous. But I think what Marissa is arguing persuasively is that there is something already in Jung and Jungian thinking that is leaning towards that, and there is
Agreed.
the possibility of that containing space. And if you look at how regulation is changing now in various contexts, in the UK and the US, people are starting to revisit this, and there needs to be, I guess, this reassurance that yes, if if done well and done in a safe, containing space, there is value to this. Let's explore what that value is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is a emerging art form, I think. And I don't think it can fit within any context that we're aware of, at least in a way that's completely satisfying to someone like I don't want to speak for you. I was going to say people like you and I, but like because what are the options? It's and what are people attracted to? It's you should go the traditional shamanistic route. That's one way to approach it. You should go the psychoanalytic route that's been studied and put out there by Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies and all the studies they've done to get all of this stuff unscheduled and back into therapeutic treatment. And then
Mhm,
and then there's sort of like these in betweens, like people
mhm,
who are sort of shamanistically educated and archetypally educated, and they're educated in sort of an analytical psychology context, and you're sort of like slapping it all together. But
mhm,
that's why I'm saying I feel like it's an emerging art form. I don't think we know how to work with, for me, I think the reason it's to editorialize on Jung, which I think is very very dubious, particularly because like LSD and psilocybin weren't even
mhm,
really around in Jung's time, so they had access to like uh I'm forgetting the one that Doors of Perception is about, um mescaline. They had like
mhm,
mescaline was what was around for them, but I don't know if there is a I don't know if we can for sure say what Jung would have thought, where my mind goes is that active imagination is sort of like turning the faucet onto a trickle and like following the water and like going in slowly, and
mhm,
taking
mhm.
a large dose of a psychedelic is like, let's completely open the dam and let the
Sure.
unconscious just flood in and try to
Yeah.
deal with that.
Mhm,
And to an extent, I think that that can be a very cathartic thing, but it's often not something that you can immediately piece together into anything constructive or instructive. And you really have to let it marinate and integrate and
mhm, mhm,
uh, take root for a while for it to start to help you grow. And I think
mhm.
that's good too, because it really, I'm sure you know of this, or maybe you experience this in your own analysis. Is like some people have trouble putting things down. Like some people have trouble understanding, like, oh, this is the ego that I'm holding on to, or this is the idea of myself that I'm holding on to. And sometimes you just need a force greater than yourself to just rip it out of your hand to like show you what you're not seeing. And it can be really great for that, but it can also be incredibly destabilizing. So
Sure.
it's
Sure.
certainly a and man, Mercurius is like the perfect
Mhm.
representation of all
Mhm.
of the stuff that we're talking about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think what you've said there just at the end, it reminded me of, ultimately psychotherapy is, you could see it as scientific to a certain extent, but also an art ultimately.
Yeah.
There's an art to doing things. And, there is this strand of thinking within psychoanalysis that everything a clinician needs to know or an analyst needs to know, they learn in the first session with you. They know everything that needs to happen, how things unfold. But there's something about decorum. Again, we go back to this idea of decorum that you're not going to tell them right then and there, this is exactly what's wrong with you, and boom, there it is. Because what's going to happen? They're going to run away. It's like opening the floodgates right away. And I think really that process is to help facilitate the analysand's own knowledge and coming to the conclusion themselves. So it
Yeah.
may be a year down the line, 10 years down the line, whatever it is, but it's kind of holding that space for that realization. In a sense, when an analysand comes in, there's something there that they can't handle, and they give it to the analyst to hold,
Mm-hmm.
and the
Mm-hmm.
analyst is there to hold that for them until a time where they can give it back to them. You asked me to hold this for you, now you're ready to take this back. And I think that rapport and that relationship is so important. And Jung was not always the best at that. There's that example from the Tavistock lectures where he, after a few sessions and a dream series from a patient, he basically tells them exactly what's wrong with them. And guess what? The person runs away, doesn't complete the analysis, and the
Mm.
things that Jung was telling him in terms of the danger he was in, they actually come to fruition.
Wow.
I think there was a time as well that someone was late for an analysis, and Jung was pretty pissed off, so he just went off in his sailboat. And as the analysis is coming along, he's just kind of sailing away, not looking. So I don't think Jung necessarily was always the best exemplar, if you will, of that level of decorum. But I think certainly there are big contributions that he's made to thinking about and framing the analytic setting that are still standard
Yeah.
today.
And weren't there cases too where he would turn people away, like people who would come to him and he would just be like, "I don't think you're really ready yet." Like sometimes people were too young, or he would have an initial conversation with them and they'd be sort of obsessed with all of these exoteric questions, and he could kind of just he's like they're really not ready to do the deep work, and he would just be like, come back and however many you work with this person for a while and then maybe come back to me,
Yes,
or that kind of stuff.
exactly. He did that with Wolfgang Pauli.
Yeah. Oh yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
together they shaped the idea of synchronicity, which the paper Anne and I wrote about leans heavily on synchronicity.
Mm.
But I think there are all those moments where he probably realizes, well, what is the potential transference and countertransference? Maybe even thinking about typology, that it might be better to refer this to somebody else. The classic case I can remember is not actually Jung but Freud, where someone comes in. Basically, it was a student, a poor student that comes in, tells Freud all his issues. And what does Freud do? He puts a bit of money in an envelope and gives it to and basically writes a little note. I think you're fine. You just need a nice meal. It's on me.
Oh
And
wow.
and, and that was it.
That'd be a good way to keep me coming back to therapy when I was in college. It's like if you'd give me a little envelope of money each time. Um, well, I can't ignore an opportunity to talk synchronicity. So maybe we can wrap it up with a
Sure,
little
sure.
synchronicity wrap. What elements of synchronicity were you looking at in your paper?
Yeah. So again, bringing it back to my own subjectivity, and realizing where this writing is coming from. The two people who shaped and changed my life. One was a historian who taught a course on global history. One's a Jungian analyst. And I really, in my initial PhD proposal, I was looking from a subjective point of view, to honor both my mentors and say I can bring these two fields together. Now it didn't turn out
Mm,
like that, because the PhD became a very specific foundation, if you will, of thinking about Jung and history and the social sciences more generally. And I always felt that there's something more I need to write. There's something that I wanted to write, but I wasn't ready to write. And it's taken me 17 years to put it together. And now it's finally coming into print. So I feel that this is almost like a culmination in many respects, that what I couldn't write as a 20 something year old, I finally was able to write it as a 40 something year old, and we're going to put it out in the world. But basically, it brings together this idea of synchronicity and the values and thinking I learned from global history, that ultimately, if you look at the events in the world, they're completely interconnected. And Tim had this really, interesting idea of looking at global history through a kind of Buddhist lens, that
mm,
ultimately what happens in this one place has reverberations and affects what's happening somewhere else. And this sense of interconnectedness, of knowing that what we do has reverberations and impact on others, should lead to a more kind of compassionate framework and understanding, and say it's not us versus them, it's us, it's us. And I really resonated with that. Now in global history, a lot of people are actually looking more for economic connections, trade, etc., etc.
yeah.
And what I was trying to do with this idea is to think more about the psychological connections that connects events throughout the world. Now, just rewinding a little bit on this course that Tim taught, 10 Days That Shook the World, it was phenomenal. Tim basically started us on a little island, I think, off of, oh God, what was the island again? It'll come to me, but a small little island in Canada. And then we went off to 10 seemingly unconnected events throughout the world, from the Battle of Algiers to Gandhi. So we went completely over the board. And what he did at the end was phenomenal. He brought every single instance back to this one island and how everything interconnected and found expression in this one island. So it was phenomenal. So it was adapting that and applying it to synchronicity. So for your audience, and Jung had three kind of main synchronicities, but then he also posited 4 and 5 as well. So I'll just go through them quickly.
Yeah,
The
please.
first one is the classic instance of the scarab,
Mm-hmm.
right? That Jung met with a patient who was absolutely leaning on a thinking function. Jung described her as someone who could match his intellect and almost kind of defeat him in many ways. So in that regard, he realized that he couldn't connect with her by butting heads with the thinking function. He had to almost use the auxiliary function in order to hope for some transformation. And basically, she comes to him with this dream where she's given this really expensive brooch in the shape of a scarab. And how Jung describes that particular instance then is, at the moment she begins to retell this dream, there's something knocking at his window. And he's very attentive to it. He opens the window, grabs basically the beetle, the closest thing to a scarab in those parts, and sees it and presents it to her and say, well, here's your scarab. And it was this meeting of both the inner and outer in almost a kind of simultaneous manner. And that is your first example, if you will, of a synchronicity,
Yeah.
where the inner psychological expression, if you will, is being met by something physical, objective in the real world, to almost hammer home the point that this is something really important. And
Yeah.
Roderick Mayne basically argues that this symbol of rebirth is exactly what was needed at that particular time, that she need to let go of that very or that adherence to that thinking function,
Mm-hmm.
to be allowed to be moved and transformed by that intuition, let's say. So
Yeah.
not fighting her on thinking, not going to the extreme opposite, which would be feeling, but moving through the auxiliary and tertiary functions. So that's your first example of a synchronicity. And then I always like,
Can I tell you a
yeah,
cool story real quick?
yeah,
So
cool.
I just did a podcast with a new friend of mine named Molly Adler. She has a podcast where she talks similar stuff. It's called Back from the Borderline. But she just ordered a copy of the Red Book, and that day she found that exact kind of scarabid,
Hmm.
shiny green gold beetle. I don't remember where she said she found it, but it was like right there next to the book or something. And she took
Yeah.
a picture of it. I'm like, oh, that's perfect. Yeah.
Sure. So it's meant to be. And I think that's the important thing about synchronicities, that they're perceived to be meaningful, that there
Right.
is an impact in some way, shape, or form on the individual that speaks to them, and progresses, I think, their own individuation. So going back to 2 and 3, then the second one is basically space collapsing. I would basically, yeah, define it as the collapsing of time and space, the second one being space. So Jung talks about the visions of Swedenborg, where, now let me get this right. There was a fire raging in Stockholm, I think it was, and he was in Gothenburg at a party, but he almost began, to have these visions of this great fire, and it was only throughout the night where these reports were kind of coming back in, and that they were able to verify that everything he was saying was actually occurring at that time. So you can see in this particular example that our notions of space actually collapse. So in the sense that he's X amount of miles away, from the major city, but he is able to express and provide in uncanny detail the events that are actually happening in there. So there's something there about the psychoid archetype, about the psyche, where really notions of time and space are our constructions that we impose in order to bring a certain amount of order.
Yeah.
Where really in the unconscious, these things are much more fluid. And in a
Yeah.
synchronicity, those notions of space can actually collapse. So we see the true reality and the power of the unconscious. So
Yeah.
that's number two.
Unus mundus.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then in the third example, it's collapsing our notions of time, where basically it's precognition. So even in dreams, if we're not supposed to at least rationally be able to see into the future, and yet there are these moments through dreams, through fantasies, where that absolutely collapses, and we are able to see into the future. So in terms of a diagnosis of a particular dream, whether it's linked to physical illness, to death, etc., Jung, in his experience, found that it's possible. So he kind of defines these three major notions of synchronicity. And then he kind of alludes to four and five, because it's always something about the relatively simultaneous meeting of inner and outer. And
Mm-hmm.
he begins playing with, well, what about the simultaneous meeting of two inner states of mind without necessarily the intervention of an outer state? And
Mm.
that's interesting. I've played with this idea with my students all the time. I've got some great answers in terms of, twins, um, death that happens in the context of twins. A lot of it is actually with twins. So it's very interesting.
Interesting.
And then he goes to the next one, number five. What if there was the meeting of two external events without necessarily the intervention of an internal state? So
Mm.
you could probably see where I'm heading with this, is that looking at that number five, linking it to global history, can we use synchronicity as a framework to understand perhaps the psychological connection between events that are happening in the world, and connections that are not necessarily causal, but acausal, in the
Yeah.
sense that they are psychologically significant. They tell us something, if you will, about the collective. And that's what the paper's about. And it builds a methodology. It sounds like really academic. And let's just be honest, Michael, in order for me to survive, I have to write the big academic papers so that I can write the fun stuff that I want about Stranger Things, or
Yeah.
Spider-Man, or music, whatever it is I want to write. But this one, we were really rigorous. We kind of broke down two selected, not necessarily, yeah, would say events, but then a body of work around events, and then try to really kind of tease out, how do you prove that an archetype has been constellated? And that work, necessarily, it hasn't been done. There have been papers about, let's say, the clinical efficacy of Jungian Jungian analysis, and that's fantastic. But in terms of this more academic environment where we have to survive, it's an archetype is a hypothesis. It always will be a hypothesis, and we don't want to kill the unknown in it, if you will. But
Yeah.
equally, there has to be some rigor in terms of how we try to say this thing has been constellated. Here's the proof. And I think what we've tried to do in the paper is to balance um, what Jung would call directed thinking and indirect thinking. So direct thinking, the more conscious way, if you will, of engaging with things, of trying to find the rational connections. And that was the building of the methodology itself. But then kind of honoring the unknowing, the meaningful in the interpretation. So it was kind of a two-pronged movement, that we were trying to um, speak to the pressures, if you will, and the desire to want to have that causal connections, but then not letting go of the fact that what's transformational in Jung is actually not creating the method, but interpreting the data, right? And
Mm.
that's where it's really important. The two events, or the event that we chose, the synchronistic meeting, was in 2019.
Mm.
And 2019 was the 30th anniversary of the DVD release of Akira. And if you
Okay.
know the film Akira, all the
Yeah. Yeah.
shit happened in 2019. So it's very interesting. And then 2019 is also the year that Greta Thunberg was named Person of the Year. So we tried to take those two moments together to show there's something really fascinating here that's happened, and why this image of the child gets constellated in 2019.
Hmm. Crazy. Okay. Wow, that's interesting. I'm trying.
I'll send you the paper.
It's been
I'll send
so
you the paper when
long.
it's
It's been so long since I've seen Akira, so it's hard for me to
yeah.
remember. I mean, I know the gist, but um, that's very interesting. But I'd never thought about this idea of perhaps a synchronicity could happen when no individual mind is present, like like two synchronistic physical events occurring. But if you think
Yeah.
about the power of that idea, I mean, you you could really almost develop a synchronicity hypothesis for reality itself, because think about how many unbelievably fortuitous things need to line up for the universe to exist. And we've explained this through various hypotheses in physics, like the multiverse, the anthropic principle, like pure randomness and luck. And it's like, well, all of those things are unbelievably squishy, other than when you put equations behind them. So maybe,
Yeah.
I mean, you could almost extrapolate synchronicity into existence in and of itself in some kind of
Yeah, yeah,
way.
and it is a mind melt, in many
Yeah.
ways, because every time I've tried to think of these possibilities of 4 and 5 with my students who've been absolutely fantastic, sometimes you can't help but think there is some intervention of a psychological state. So even if we play with the idea of two external events that are synchronistic and meet relatively simultaneously, I guess the intervention of the psychological state is that there is this such a thing as, a collective zeitgeist,
Yeah.
something that is installating within the society itself. So in that regard, um, the paper does have to acknowledge that the psychological thing that is constellated is evidenced in those two things that we've decided to think about, i.e., the naming of Greta Thunberg as Person of the Year in 2019, and the reappearance, if you will, in our psyches of Akira and all the apocalyptic themes about the future, about children, the power of children, the dangers of children, all kind of coalescing at the same time. So I think there's still a lot of work that can be done, and hopefully this paper is just that first step in saying, wow, let's blow this apart, man.
Yeah.
Everyone is really comfortable with synchronicities 1, 2, and 3, and that's fantastic. But what are the possibilities for psychosocial studies with a hyphen? That's a whole nother thing. But what is the possibility of applying Jung to understanding culture, society, history, etc.? There is a benefit there, but we have to kind of mobilize it in such a way where we present Jung in the best light possible,
Yeah.
of what it can do, what it can be as well, given some of its limitations.
Yeah. There's an angle to synchronicity that I became aware of recently. And I want to give credit to this guy, Dr. Justin Riddle, who has this YouTube channel. He, I believe, is a neuroscientist, but he is very interested in Jung, very interested in Platonism and uh, quantum theory and a few other things. But anyway,
Mm-hmm.
he he put this hypothesis together. Then I also took this and ran with it and made a video about it,
Mm-hmm.
which hinges on Penrose, the famous Nobel Prize winning physicist. Penrose considers himself a mathematical Platonist in that he believes that the fact that the world is intelligible in and of itself hinges on the fact that certain, what we would call mathematical rules, have to be imbued in reality at a deeper level. And
Yeah,
he
that's
likens those rules to the Platonic realm of forms, that
mm-hmm.
there is this underlying logos logic imbued
Mm-hmm.
in reality. And through um, psychological rigor, we can touch that realm, because of course we can
Yeah.
do math, we can
Yeah, yeah,
recognize these higher um, kinds of order, but there's a limit to what we can understand. So really just kind of cutting to the nucleus, because I don't think you require all the exposition.
yeah.
This idea emerges that what if the missing piece to synchronicity that we don't think about, like the missing part in this psychophysical bridge, is
Mhm.
this realm of forms that we're connected to, but we're not in charge of, right? Like this is something like through, platonically speaking, we can interact with through the personal logos, but it's not
Mhm.
it's like and it also you're probably familiar with the fact that Jung likens the collective unconscious to the Platonic eidos, so like to the
Sure.
Platonic image. So he's
Mhm. Mhm.
essentially saying that the collective unconscious is the symbolic and archetypal
Yeah.
version of the Platonic realm of forms. So now you
Mhm.
have
Mhm.
this interesting interplay between you have the psychical, you have the physical, and you have this third connecting thing that you could think of as the
Sure.
Platonic realm of forms or the archetypal. And what appears to us as a synchronicity may be the way that I put it is like the harmony of all three of those worlds sort of flashing in your
Mhm.
subjective reality all at once,
Sure.
where you almost have this wave collapse type moment of
Yeah.
it not making sense because we're not directly aware of this platonic realm of forms. I thought that was a really, really interesting idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, you can see Jung calls moments of synchronicities um, moments of objective meaning. And it
Yeah.
seems quite high flown, but in a sense, what he's saying, objective, there's a holistic understanding of what this means, both physically, mentally, psychologically, individually, collectively. So it's kind of an all encompassing, holistic point of view. Von Franz wrote a bit, extended Jung's thinking and synchronicity into the realm of numbers, truly
Mm.
archetypal. Even a colleague recently published a book on Jungian numbers, but it's absolutely right. I mean, if you look at the golden mean, ratios, even nature in terms of seashells and spirals, they're all
Yeah.
kind of forming to this archetypal equation, if you will. So I think there's something deeply archetypal about numbers, about the physical world, and hopefully we're inspiring people to kind of take it into those realms because in many ways Jung belongs or is housed currently in the social sciences, perhaps in the arts and humanities, in literature departments, in religion departments, but there is something to kind of extending it into these these other realms. Rupert Sheldrake
Yeah.
did a lot, and I think his son actually is starting to kind of go into this area as well. So I mean, there's a lot of fascinating possibilities.
Yes, man. Well, this has been a fantastic, fantastic mind meld. I had high expectations, and I love that feeling of the flow starting and then looking up, and it's like 90 minutes later. And I feel like that's the experience I just had, my friend. So glad we
Very
finally made
cool.
this happen. Thank you for doing it. Would love to have you back anytime. And please tell people everything you got going on because I know you have a book coming out. Um, and I don't know what else.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again, Michael, for having me. And once we had that kind of pre-meet, it's like, yeah, this is legit. I need to be here. And what a pleasure it's been. So thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
the book's coming out. It's uh, part of the Routledge Basics series, and it's basically an introduction to Jung's collected works. So Anne and I have tried to condense 18 volumes of writing into something that is hopefully readable, enjoyable, an introduction, but also a tool for research. Because what we've done, and this nearly killed me, is basically looking through the collected works, taking out or extracting Jung's key quotations and thinking about
Oh
certain
my
concepts,
God.
complexes, archetypes, and we've put it in a chart basically saying where you can find it. So in essence, anyone who's pursuing MA work, even undergrad, PhD, if you need, where did Jung say this? It's kind of
Yeah.
going to be in that chart. So yeah, so
I
that
need
was
that.
you.
I need that, man. I need that.
That book was years in the making. So it's supposed to be out in January. I mean, the proofs are sitting in my inbox right now. There are a few things we need to kind of take care of, but that should be coming out soon. So even if you look on some of the larger websites, bookshops, the book will be there. It's under Kevin Lewin and Yeoman. So that'll be cool. And once that paper drops, it's already been accepted into the International Journal for Jungian Studies. Some really kind of lovely news. The editor basically told me that it was the the one paper that now holds the record for going through the review process the quickest. So it was turned around in eight
Nice.
days with unanimous approval. And for me, that was just really important. This recognition of I've worked really hard on this and was in partnership with me because the methodology needs a second person who is a clinician to help me go through that. But yeah, that's coming out, and once it's published, Michael, I'll send it to you, and you can hopefully share that with your community and just
Yeah.
get the word out. And of course, I'd love to come back and have a chat further about anything else.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's definitely do it when the book drops, and it's going to be invaluable for not only for me, but also when people are like, "Where do I start with Jung? What do I read?" I think I was telling you this last time. It's always just like, I don't like you might not be ready to like dive straight into Jung's primary writings because there's so much, it's not like you can understand like, okay, he is writing from the perspective of a yogi or something like there, like his perspective he was creating, he was like creating this multidisciplinary mythopoetic way of thinking that, and that's why he was so singular, because he essentially was creating this worldview that we look back on now even, and we're trying to like piece together and make sense of. And it takes people like you with huge intellects that could actually organize these ideas, because it's really difficult otherwise, and you just almost, it's like this slow steeping exposure therapy at best otherwise, where you sort of like connect the principles over a long period of time. And there's got to be a better way, and it sounds like you're onto it. So
Oh, thanks, Michael. Again, I'm humbled by that. Really appreciative, but I'm just a regular guy who likes his music a lot and wishes he could do a bit more of that and do more of this,
yeah,
and to really try to translate Jung to a larger, wider audience and say, you don't need people always talking this kind of high flown language and writing in a particular style. I think that's the one thing that bothers me about academia sometimes, that
yeah.
people write to obscure and to create barriers rather than to open things up and to create dialogue with as many people as possible. And that's, if there's one thing I'm about, it's about that.
Well said. Well said. Well, let's wrap this up. Worship, and I'll talk to you soon, I hope.